Welcome everyone from Murphy to Manteo, the podcast of the Highway 64 project at Elon University, a collaboration between the Professional Writing and Rhetoric program and the Department of Environmental Studies. In the Highway 64 project, we explore North Carolina through the lens of culture, food, community, sustainability, and climate resiliency. Highway 64, our North Carolina heritage highway, stands as our metaphor for the diversity of peoples, places, and bioregions that is North Carolina. Join us as we travel the state, talk with interesting people, and explore thought-provoking ideas.
Welcome everybody to the From Murphy to Manteo podcast, the official podcast of the Highway 64 project. This is our initial episode. The Highway 64 podcast is a collaboration between PWR, Professional Writing and Rhetoric, and the Environmental Studies Department at Elon University. I am Michael Strickland, the director of the Center for Environmental Studies. And with me here today are the Highway 64 podcast crew. Our guest for today is an old friend of mine and a former colleague, Janet McFall, who was the founding chair of the Environmental Studies Department and formerly director of the Center for Environmental Studies, position I now hold. And we'll be talking with her and asking her questions about the work she's doing these days. With me here are my crew. The first is Caden Halberg. Caden, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, I'm Caden Halberg. I'm a senior at Elon, class of 2026. I'm majoring in professional writing and rhetoric, and I'm minoring in environmental studies. I've been working on the Highway 64 project since my sophomore year, and right now I'm trying to help bridge the environmental studies department and the professional writings department, and I'm basically just running the website and looking at all the content that the students are getting and creating and just trying to figure out where it should go on the website.
Okay, and then our podcast producer is Olivia Grady. I'll let Olivia introduce herself, and then she will start the questions for Dr. McFall.
Yes, and then we can jump into it. Thank you for all of your patience too. We really appreciate it. Like Dr. Strickland said, my name's Olivia. I'm a senior as well, majoring in professional writing and rhetoric with a minor in philosophy, politics, and economics. So it's safe to say that environmental science is not necessarily my forte. So I'm very excited to learn more from the experts and what you guys have to say specifically about the Haw River Assembly. So I'll just start with some basic questions. So Dr. McFall, from what I hear, you've been even more active with certain environmental organizations in your retirement, even before you left Elon. And I know that the Haw River Assembly is one of the many hats that you wear these days. But I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the organization. So sort of its history, structure, mission, and just sort of, if you had to put it in your own words, like your own summation of the Haw River Assembly.
They are a strong advocacy organization for the Haw River. They were founded in around 1980 in opposition to the construction of Jordan Dam and Jordan Lake. Jordan Dam was conceived as a project to reduce flooding downstream in the Cape Fear River. And it was thought that a lot of the water causing downstream flooding was coming from the upper Cape Fear, primarily the Haw River. And so the organization was formed in opposition to that project. Well, they weren't very successful, and the dam was completed in 1982, the B. Everett Jordan Dam. And the dam itself is on the Haw River, but it's primarily New Hope Creek that has flooded, which extends up towards Durham. But there's a lot of the lake is on the main stem of the Haw River. And the organization decided that rather than disband, their mission could change to advocate for the river. It was predicted by scientists that when the Jordan Lake was built, it was likely to become rapidly eutrophic because of all the sediments and the nutrients that were coming from the communities that had tributaries and were discharging water into New Hope Creek and also into the Haw River. So the organization changed their mission from being in opposition to the dam to accepting the dam and saying, what can we do to save this? How can we keep the river clean, and how can we keep the lake clean? They have all kinds of activities, and they do all kinds of things. They do advocacy. They've worked with the Southern Environmental Law Center a lot on different lawsuits. They also have a Streamwatch program where they have volunteers across the watershed who adopt sites, and they go out every month and they take water quality measurements. And they do such a good job that those measurements are now being included in the state data set for water quality. How cool is that? You usually have to be a professional environmental scientist to do that work. They are so good at it that uh, it's been incorporated into the state data set. Their main mission right now also is education. They have started back 30, 35, 36, maybe longer years ago, something called the Haw River Learning Celebration. And with this learning celebration, they are a week in Bynum, which is downstream of where I am. They are a week in Saxapahaw, and my neighbors and I are actually the Saxapahaw host site. And they are a week in Guilford County. And at each of those sites, volunteers many of them will camp at the site. They bring in fourth graders on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and they have an amazing program for those kids. They can take them out into the river. They do aquatic insects where they catch the aquatic insects and can look at them and can play with them with their hands and pick them up and stuff. There's a clay station, an art station, a watershed station where they have an envirothon or an enviroscape where they can put different things on the landscape and then see how it affects the river on the big model. And then they go have lunch with the volunteers. And then they do an amazing puppet show with 20-foot tall puppets. It's just amazing. And then they end up at the end of the puppet show, they all stand up and dance.
Oh, that sounds so fun. I wish I had something like that in my elementary
Me
school.
too.
I probably would have paid better attention in my science class. Yeah, so it seems like you've addressed a lot of, sort of the focuses that Haw Rivers had, but I feel like that kind of bled into my next question. What are the major challenges that you see the assembly then dealing with, I guess, in the near future in comparison to what it's been dealing with and focusing on in the past?
Well, one of the challenges really is to help people understand the threats to the river. I'll finish with my learning celebration bit of trivia, which is by now they have taught 40,000 children in the
Wow.
time they've been doing the learning celebration. And many of the children who participated as children are now back as volunteers. So one of the really big parts of their mission is to engage people in river issues, to understand the threats to the river, and to be an advocate and an active partner in dealing with those threats. Some of the major threats are flooding, as we have had more impervious surface with development across the watershed. The Haw River watershed is about 1,700 square miles, so it's a pretty big watershed. And with all the development, Greensboro, Durham, Burlington, there's a lot more impervious surface. We also are dealing with the history of agriculture because there is a whole foot, if you can imagine that, a whole foot of topsoil that is washed away in the Haw River watershed, and that sediment ended up on the areas next to the river and in the river and silting up Jordan Lake too. So the sediment issue and the flooding are huge issues. We have had the river goes over its bank typically at least once or twice a year now through these major flooding events. So I know Professor Strickland is going to ask some questions about that later. And the third big issue for them is emerging contaminants. And these are chemicals that are now being discharged into the river. And I want to emphasize that our legal structure is that these things are these are not illegal activities. Are they unethical? Yes. But these are not illegal activities. There are 47,000 chemicals listed with the EPA as being in use in the United States. Of those, less than 200 are regulated. So, like the PFAS that people have been very concerned about, the discharge of PFAS into the rivers, including the Haw River, have been absolutely legal. Is it ethical? No. Do we understand the health benefit or the health risks to some of these chemicals? No. Do we drink the water out of the Haw River? Yes. The water from Pittsboro's drinking water comes from the Haw. All that water goes down to Jordan Lake, and more municipalities are looking to Jordan Lake as a drinking water source. Another big contaminant of concern is dioxane, and that also comes from industrial sources into the river. And so all these they're considered emerging contaminants because they're pretty new and they're ubiquitous. Like the PFAS chemicals, PFAS and PFAS chemicals, they come from fire retardants, they come from nonstick cookware, they come from children's clothing with the fire retardant chemicals. There are hundreds of sources of these types of chemicals, and they're all a little bit different. The characteristic is that there's a carbon atoms bound to fluorine atoms, and it makes these molecules very, very stable. They can't be broken down typically by the microbial community that participates in degradation and breaking these things down and making them harmless. And so these are considered forever chemicals, the PFAS and PFAS, but they're not alone in this category of being forever chemicals. So emerging contaminants is the third big priority.
Yeah, I mean, my next question too is going to be why are they of such concern? But I feel like I already know at this point.
Well, I'll
Lined
come
up.
back to the flooding. One
Yeah.
of the big effects of the floods that happens and these big surges of water is that it's actually causing the river to widen. And I published a paper a couple of years ago that actually documented that the river is actually getting wider with these flood events because it's eroding the banks, collapse with erosion as the bottom of the soil gets taken out with the flooding. And so the banks collapse and the river is actually getting wider. It's not getting more water in it. So that means that the river is getting shallower. And as the river gets shallower, all kinds of ecological things can happen. It gets warmer. It's more prone to sedimentation because the river doesn't flow as fast and with as much power and energy. It's not good habitat necessarily for the organisms that live there. So the flooding is a really big deal because it's causing huge, profound environmental impacts to the river. And these widening impacts are pretty much unrecognized.
Yeah. Does that mean that then more of the actual content within the river from the flooding is those chemicals? Like it's making up more of the water once that happens?
No, the concentration is dependent on the volume of water that's moving. It's just that the distribution of that same volume of water across the cross section of the river has changed because the river is wider. The amount of water is the same, so it's getting shallower.
Yeah. Okay. I'll hand it over to Caden now because he has some questions about your work with the PCC as well.
Sure.
Yeah. So we were talking about your work with the river or the Haw River Assembly earlier, and you were bringing up how like people, I guess how currently there are people who like to help volunteer, and I've been affiliated and worked with and volunteered with land conservancies in the past, so I have a general idea of what it means to like why it's important or the importance of this and what it means to be involved with work like this. But I was just wondering, like we were talking about the PCC, which is the Piedmont Conservation Council.
Yes.
Could you just share a little bit about what the Piedmont Conservation Council's mission is, and then how their work fits into broader regional efforts, and just related to land and water conservation?
Sure. The organizations are very different. The Haw River Assembly is a membership organization. They have about 1,000 members right now, and so people can buy a membership for about $25. And so the Haw River Assembly is very much a community outreach, community-based, community activism organization. The Piedmont Conservation Council, in contrast, is the members are local governments. There are 11 counties that are members of the Piedmont Conservation Council. This is an outcome of a project from the U.S. Department of Agriculture that was started in the 1960s. And they created something called RC&Ds, which stands for Rural Conservation and Development. And so the mission of RC, and they're all over the state. I don't know how many active RC&Ds there are right now in North Carolina. I think it's maybe 10, but it's a county membership. And so our county, Alamance County, is a member. They pay $3,000 a year for their membership dues, as do the other 9 counties. And then we have representatives from each county that serve on the board of directors. And I served on their board of directors and also their executive board of directors, their executive committee, for many years. But their mission is really looking at community development and economic development that's consistent with sustainability and conservation principles. Most people think of, or the media wants us to believe, that economic development is in conflict with conservation and protection of the environment. But in fact, the Piedmont Conservation Council and others can show very clearly that that is not the case. Good economic development, sustainable and sound economic development absolutely depend on a healthy environment and sustainability, or the city's going to have to relocate or not be able to drink their water anymore. So the PCC, their projects very much are related to economic development to really help the local communities. We've done a lot of work for stream restorations where we get grant money from the federal or the governments, where we have teams come in and they actually will reshape the stream or river and put it back into its natural state. But they also design them understanding that the flooding impacts are very different today than they were historically. And so the stream restoration projects are designed so that the communities that are flooding from these streams now don't flood anymore. And often there might be a recreational trail that's put next to it. For example, the Haw River Trail, that's not a PCC project. That's actually an Elon project. But the Haw River Trail, our mission is conservation through recreation. And that is also the motto for the Piedmont Conservation Council. How can we do sustainable development that supports economic growth and economic development while also enhancing the ecosystem services that are provided to us? And the ecosystem services are really something that the PCC focuses on. Do we have clean water? Do we have clean air? Do we have food? Are we supporting sustainable local agriculture? One of the grants that we got was to actually a farmer's market manager. And we hired someone who was a full-time farmer's market manager to develop the Elon Farmer's Market, the Mebane Farmer's Market, and to develop another one in Burlington that was in a low-resource community. And so how can we promote economic development? How can we promote community development while also enhancing these ecosystem services that the natural world provides to us and that we absolutely depend on?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, Janet, I have a final question for you that kind of overlaps all that we've been talking about. And I know it's a topic that you and I have talked together about a lot over time, and it connects up with the flooding events. And you folks on the Haw River down in Saxapahaw especially had a really horrific flooding event from Tropical Storm Chantal, a very minor storm that came ashore in South Carolina several hundred miles away, didn't do much damage at all there, way up into North Carolina and dropped 11 inches of rain on your region and completely flooded out many communities along the way. You and I have talked about how the average rainstorm, summer afternoon rainstorm these days drops 2.5, 3, 4 inches sometimes, which was never the case when you and I were young. Could you say a little bit about how, from your perspective, climate change is impacting these kinds of extreme weather events? Because as you know, one of the focuses of the Highway 64 project is on community climate resiliency and what communities need to be aware of as these kind of extreme weather events are increasing in regularity and intensity.
This has been a huge underappreciated issue. We all know that warm air holds more moisture than cold air. In the summertime, we might get really humid days, but in the wintertime, the air is really dry. Well, as the climate continues to warm, the atmosphere just holds more water. And as more water is held in the atmosphere, well, it comes down as rain eventually. And typically, historically, we might have 1 or 2 inches of rainfall throughout a day, maybe 2 days. During Chantal, I had 9 inches of rain in a 20-hour period at my house. And people upstream of me, some of those areas had 11 inches of rain in a 20-hour period. And that water, it comes flowing down the tributaries and flowing down. It did flood at my house. The river was probably about 30 feet above what's called base flow, which is where the water normally would be, if we haven't had a big rainfall and it's not droughty, it was about 30 feet above where the surface of the water normally would be. So it came way above the banks. It came way up the hillside, on the areas that are adjacent to the river. And that caused a huge amount of damage. it took down trees. I lost 5 trees, big trees that were this big from my riverbank with the most recent flood from Chantal. So it's huge, but it's hard to appreciate how much water the atmosphere is holding now with a pretty subtle, what seems to us a pretty small increase in temperature, but it allows the air to hold way more moisture than it has in the past. And when it dumps it, it really dumps it.
I think you and I both agree that one of the most critical impact points in most of the communities in the Highway 64 corridor are the folks who work in stormwater.
Oh,
And
yes.
I really feel for them because their funding has not increased, but the amount of water they have to deal with, as you said, from all the new development and now from the intensity of the storms, and they're working with infrastructure that was designed and put in place 30, 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, when the estimates for the amount of water it needed to handle was much smaller.
Yep.
This is going to be critical for these communities going down the road, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And add to that, most of our cities here have the stormwater separate from the municipal sewer, the domestic sewer, which
Right.
is as it should be. We don't need to be treating water, rainfall water here. But most of our domestic sewer pipes are at least 30 years old, and they're kind of leaky. And so when it rains and there's all that water coming down through the soil, it actually puts pressure on the pipes, and the water from the soil actually goes into the sewer pipes, and then it goes to the wastewater treatment plant. And the wastewater treatment plants are designed for, what comes from homes, the showers and the sinks and the toilets and stuff. They're not designed for all this rainwater to go into the pipes too. And it's because the pipes are old and kind of leaky, and the water pressure from all that water in the groundwater just pushes into the pipes, and it causes the wastewater treatment plants to have to deal with way more water than they were designed to deal with. And so a lot of that, when that happens, sometimes that water it's untreated water then that gets discharged into the river because the plant just can't handle all of that. So with these big rainfalls, we have flooding, we have damage from the floods, and we also have problems with the wastewater plants because they just can't handle this unexpected huge increase in flow.
And this is something that communities and especially taxpayers are going to have to face up to and need to better understand.
Well, there's no such thing as climate change. We all know this.
Unfortunately. Well, Janet, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to be the host, the guest on our inaugural episode of the Highway 64 podcast. You are a shining example of what we should all be doing in terms of community work, especially in your retirement years when most people will be taking it easy. You are out there fighting. We appreciate that.
I'm a really bad golf player, so this is my alternative.
Well, thank you to everybody who's watching in. You're viewing the season 1, episode 1 of the From Murphy to Manteo podcast. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us for the From Murphy to Manteo podcast. Be sure and check out our website at highway64.net and follow our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. If you have questions or ideas for folks who might want to host on the podcast, you can email us at highway64@gmail.com. Thank you.